The calm before the storm. It was a crisp autumn morning in downtown Philadelphia, and the city's rhythm was palpable. The rush of footsteps, the sound of distant honking horns, and the hum of people going about their daily business filled the air. But for Jessica Morgan, today was different. It wasn't just another day in the city. She walked briskly down Market Street, her briefcase clutched tightly in her right hand. The weight of the leather was a familiar comfort, but the burden of what she was about to face weighed heavily on her shoulders. Jessica, a recent Harvard Law graduate, had been thrust into a situation much larger than she could have ever imagined. As a young woman of color, she had always known the complexities of the justice system and had worked tirelessly to make sure that the voices of the oppressed were heard. But today, those complexities were going to come to a head. Today, she would stand at the center of a courtroom, battling not just for the victims, but for something far more important: accountability. Jessica's purpose was clear, but so were the stakes. She had been asked by Reverend Howard Newton, a respected figure in her community, to help expose the truth behind a string of police misconduct cases. The most troubling of these incidents involved two local officers known on the streets as the Teflon Twins. Officers Brian Connelly and Sean Vaughn had an impeccable track record, at least on paper. But behind the badge, their reputation was anything but clean. The Teflon Twins had built a legacy of brutality, intimidation, and a shocking disregard for the rights of Philadelphia's most vulnerable communities. Despite multiple complaints filed against them, these officers always seemed to skate free. Their connection to a powerful judge, Ethan Caldwell, only made the situation more dire. Caldwell had a reputation in the legal community. He was known for siding with the police, dismissing claims of misconduct without so much as a second glance. The victims' voices were stifled by his bias, and the communities left in the wake of these injustices were growing desperate for change. Jessica had become the unexpected face of this movement. It started with small steps: collecting affidavits from those brave enough to speak out, gathering video evidence, and documenting the countless stories of those who had been affected by the Teflon Twins. The more she uncovered, the more certain she became that the system was broken. But Jessica was different. She wasn't just another lawyer. She had the knowledge, the skills, and the resolve to see this through, no matter what it took. The community had rallied behind her. They believed in her. They trusted her to bring the truth to light, to stand up against the oppressive forces that had gone unchecked for far too long. But on this day, as Jessica approached the courthouse, she could feel the tension in the air. Protesters were gathered outside, chanting for justice, waving signs that demanded accountability. Their energy was electric, and it seemed to seep into her veins, strengthening her resolve. But as Jessica crossed the threshold of the courthouse, she was met with an overwhelming sense of unease. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating. The hum of hushed conversations filled the space as families of victims sat on one side of the courtroom, their faces etched with hope and worry. On the other side, the officers sat stoically, their uniforms pressed and immaculate, as though trying to project an image of professionalism and innocence. In front of them, perched high on the bench, was Judge Ethan Caldwell, the man who had the power to decide their fate. Jessica felt his eyes on her as she entered, his gaze piercing through the room. He seemed almost smug, his lips curling into a faint, condescending smile as she walked past. He had already made up his mind about her, just another idealistic lawyer trying to shake the foundation of a system he had long since mastered. As Jessica took her seat at the plaintiff's table, she pushed the weight of his stare out of her mind. She wasn't here to win his approval. She was here to seek justice. This would be no easy task. Caldwell's presence alone was a chilling reminder of the battle she was about to fight. But Jessica had something he didn't: determination. The evidence she had painstakingly gathered, the witness testimony she had prepared, and the unwavering belief that she could make a difference were all she needed. It was just a matter of standing her ground. Jessica adjusted her glasses and set her briefcase down on the table. The first witness was ready, Reverend Howard Newton, a man who had seen too much and been forced to carry the weight of these injustices for far too long. His testimony would set the tone for what was to come. As the proceedings began, the eyes of everyone in the room were locked on Jessica. Some doubted her. Some believed in her, but no one knew yet what this quiet, composed woman was truly capable of. The battle had begun, and the storm was about to hit. The testimony. The gavel echoed through the packed courtroom, signaling the start of the day's proceedings. The hum of whispered conversations grew quieter as Judge Ethan Caldwell leaned forward, his steely eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator sizing up its prey. His expression was unreadable, his demeanor cold, as if he had already determined the outcome of this hearing before it had even begun. Jessica Morgan took a deep breath. The weight of the moment settled on her shoulders, but she refused to let it break her. She had prepared for this for months. She had studied every piece of evidence, every legal precedent, every witness statement, and now it was time to present that truth to the court, to speak for those whose voices had been ignored for far too long. Her gaze flickered toward the defense table, where the two officers, Brian Connolly and Sean Vaughn, sat, their faces impassive. They wore their uniforms like shields, each button and crease a statement of power. Between them sat their attorney, Thomas Berryman, a seasoned legal shark with a reputation for getting even the most indefensible clients off the hook. Berryman's eyes briefly met Jessica's, and she could see the challenge in them. He knew the game was just beginning, and he was ready to fight with everything he had. But Jessica was ready too. Judge Caldwell's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "We will begin with the first witness. Reverend Howard Newton, please take the stand." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. Reverend Newton had been the one to ignite this movement, the one who had given Jessica the first taste of what the true scope of this case could be. His quiet strength had inspired her, and she knew his testimony would be a turning point. The Reverend rose from his seat, his broad shoulders draped in the fabric of a crisp navy suit. He moved with the grace of someone who had borne much pain, but had not let it define him. As he stepped toward the witness stand, Jessica caught a glimpse of his face, a man who had seen the darkest sides of the world, but had never lost his belief in justice. His eyes met hers briefly, offering a silent word of encouragement. Reverend Newton took the oath, placing his hand on the Bible, and the room fell into a tense stillness. His voice rang clear as he began to speak, recounting the series of tragic events that had unfolded in his community. He spoke of the Teflon twins and the reign of terror they had inflicted on the neighborhood. The Reverend's words were steady, but Jessica could hear the weight of his pain behind them. His community had been broken by the actions of these officers, and now he was here to make sure that truth was brought to light. "I've seen it, Your Honor," Reverend Newton began, his voice steady but firm. "I've seen the way these officers treat our people, the terror they instill in our youth, the way they break our spirits without consequence. They patrol our streets like they own them, and every time someone dares to speak out, their complaints vanish into thin air." Jessica watched as the faces of the victims' families in the gallery shifted with recognition. They knew this story all too well. She could feel the solidarity of their silent support, their hope hanging on every word the Reverend spoke. He continued, detailing the traffic stops that had escalated into brutal, unprovoked violence. He spoke of a young man who had been hospitalized after a beating that no one could explain. He spoke of the countless victims who had been too afraid to file complaints, their voices drowned out by the very system that was supposed to protect them. And he spoke of the elusive justice they had all been denied for so long. As Reverend Newton's testimony unfolded, Jessica could feel the gravity of his words pulling at the edges of the courtroom. The murmurs of disbelief from the audience were growing louder with each new revelation. But Judge Caldwell's face remained as stoic as ever. He didn't seem moved. He didn't seem to care. Jessica felt a flicker of frustration burn within her. She knew the evidence was undeniable. She knew the stories of these victims were real. But she also knew that Caldwell had already made up his mind about this case, and that thought made the pit in her stomach grow larger. The Reverend's testimony continued, each word building momentum, each detail cementing the officer's pattern of abuse. But it wasn't just the facts that mattered, it was the human element. It was the pain in Reverend Newton's voice that spoke louder than any legal argument ever could. And as Jessica sat there, absorbing every word, she knew that the community was counting on her. She couldn't let them down. She wouldn't. Finally, the time came for Jessica to question the Reverend. She rose from her seat, taking a steadying breath. This was her moment. She had prepared meticulously for this cross-examination. She had compiled every shred of evidence, every affidavit, every video clip, and now she would weave it all together to show the court the truth. Reverend Newton, Jessica began, her voice calm but firm, you've described several instances of misconduct involving officers Connolly and Vaughn. Can you speak specifically about the time you witnessed their abuse firsthand? Reverend Newton nodded solemnly. It was a Thursday evening. I was walking down the street when I saw two young men being stopped by the officers. There was no reason for the stop. It was a routine harassment, just like so many others. But this time, I saw Officer Vaughn shove one of the young men against a car, slamming his head into the door. The other officer, Connolly, just stood by and watched, as if this was normal. Jessica nodded, glancing over at the defense table. Connolly's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. The courtroom was silent, everyone hanging on the Reverend's words. Jessica carefully laid out each instance of misconduct, drawing connections between the Reverend's testimony and the mounting evidence they had gathered. The tension was thick as she presented photographs of the bruised bodies of victims, passing them around the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the stark reality of the situation became undeniable. But Judge Caldwell didn't flinch. His face remained as unreadable as ever, his expression a wall of indifference. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jessica played the first piece of video footage, a shaky cell phone recording that captured one of the incidents in question. The room fell silent as the grainy clip flickered on the large screen. The footage was horrifying. Officers Connolly and Vaughn dragging a handcuffed teenager across the pavement, his battered face pleading for mercy. The crowd gasped. Some people looked away, unable to watch, while others whispered in disbelief. Even the officers' supporters seemed uneasy. But Judge Caldwell remained unmoved, his eyes focused on the screen, betraying no emotion. When the video ended, the silence was broken by the sharp sound of Thomas Berryman rising to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he called out. "This footage is unverified. We have no proof that this was even taken on the date in question. It's completely inadmissible." Jessica's heart sank, but she was prepared. She quickly reached for the documents that verified the video's authenticity, the timestamp, the digital chain of custody. But before she could present them, Judge Caldwell's voice rang out. "Miss Morgan, I'm not convinced this footage meets the necessary standards of credibility. I'll reserve my ruling on its admissibility until you provide further corroboration." The words stung like a slap to the face. It was clear that Caldwell was going to do everything in his power to undermine this case, to protect the officers and the system that had been complicit in their abuse. Jessica's hands clenched at her sides, but she refused to let her frustration show. She would find a way. She had to. The fight was far from over. And as the courtroom recessed for a short break, Jessica gathered herself. This battle was bigger than any one witness, any single piece of evidence. It was a fight for justice, a fight she wasn't willing to lose. The weight of truth. The short recess felt like an eternity. Outside the courtroom, the air was thick with uncertainty. Jessica stood by the plaintiff's table, her hands gripping the edge as though it could anchor her to the ground. She fought to steady her breath, trying to block out the quiet murmurs from the audience. The tension was palpable, the weight of what was happening pressing down on her chest. She looked around the courtroom. Reverend Newton had returned to his seat, his face lined with both fatigue and resolve. The families of the victims, the silent witnesses to years of abuse, were waiting for something to change. There was a silent understanding among them. They weren't just hoping for justice. They were depending on it. And Jessica was their best chance. But with Judge Caldwell's blatant bias, it was hard to see how the truth could overcome the walls of indifference surrounding this case. Jessica turned her attention to the defense table. Officer Connolly sat rigidly, his face an unreadable mask, while Officer Vaughn slouched slightly, his eyes fixed on the ground. Between them, Thomas Berryman sat with a look of quiet confidence, his casual demeanor, though only heightened Jessica's determination. She could see in his eyes that he was prepared to fight tooth and nail to protect the officers, no matter how much blood had been spilled in the process. He was a master of manipulation, of twisting the narrative, and that made Jessica's task all the more urgent. She couldn't afford to let the truth be buried beneath his tactics. The courtroom doors opened, and the murmur of conversation died down as Judge Caldwell returned to the bench. His gavel struck sharply, signaling the end of the break and the continuation of the hearing. The stillness was broken by his voice, cold and dismissive. "Let's proceed," he announced. His eyes flicked over the room, and for a brief moment, Jessica felt the full weight of his gaze. It was as if he had already determined the outcome of this case, and everyone else was merely playing a part in his charade. But Jessica wasn't about to play along. She wasn't going to let this courtroom be a theater for Caldwell's arrogance. She had spent far too long fighting for the truth to let it slip away now. It was her turn again. She straightened her posture, her voice steady but resolute. "Your Honor, I call my next witness, Ms. Tabitha Brown." Tabitha Brown was a single mother in her early 30s, her life upended by a wrongful drug raid conducted by Officers Connolly and Vaughn. She had agreed to testify, knowing the emotional toll it would take, but she had also known that her story was crucial. Her experience embodied everything that was wrong with the system, and her bravery would carry the weight of not just her own suffering, but the suffering of countless others. Tabitha stood and walked to the witness stand, her hands trembling as she took the oath. She was a woman of strength, but Jessica could see the pain in her eyes. The events she was about to recount were still fresh, raw. It wasn't easy to relive such trauma, but she had found the courage to speak up, just as Jessica had done. With a soft, hesitant voice, Tabitha began her testimony. She spoke of the night her life had been torn apart, when Connolly and Vaughn arrived at her home in the dead of night, breaking down her door and accusing her of drug possession without cause. The raid was brutal. They had no warrant. The officers barged in, terrifying her young son, demanding to know where the drugs were. There were none, of course, just a mother and her child, frightened out of their minds by the men who were supposed to protect them. Tabitha's voice wavered, but she didn't falter. She recounted how she was pinned to the ground, her child forced to watch in helpless fear as she was handcuffed and thrown to the floor. The officers had made her face the carpet, pressing her head down even as she lay unresisting, her body crushed under their weight. The raid yielded no drugs, no arrests, no charges, just broken trust and a lifetime of trauma. As she spoke, Jessica's heart ached. She could see it in Tabitha's face, the emotional weight of that night still heavy on her. But Jessica also saw something else, something that gave her hope. There was a fire in Tabitha's eyes, a quiet strength that said she would not be silenced. This was not just her fight. It was the fight of every person who had been harmed, every person who had been pushed to the margins by a system meant to protect them. When Tabitha finished, Jessica's gaze met the judge's. He was staring at her, his expression impassive. But Jessica knew better than to expect any sign of compassion from him. She had seen enough to know that Judge Caldwell's loyalty was not to the victims in this case. It was to the police, to the system that had enabled their actions for so long. Bitter frustration bubbled within Jessica, but she refused to let it consume her. This was not the time to lose composure. She had to stay focused. She turned to face the defense table, where Berryman now stood, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was clear that he was ready to tear Tabitha apart, to use every tactic he could to discredit her. But Jessica wouldn't let him. Berryman began his cross-examination, his tone slick and condescending. "Ms. Brown," he began, "you've had some financial difficulties, haven't you? You've had trouble making ends meet, and isn't it true that you're seeking a settlement from the city?" Tabitha flinched, but she didn't back down. "I'm not here for money," she said firmly, her voice rising with quiet defiance. "I'm here for the truth. My son doesn't deserve to live in fear." "No one does." Berryman pressed on, trying to paint Tabitha as unreliable, as someone who might be lying for financial gain. But Jessica knew better. She had seen the pain in Tabitha's eyes when she spoke of her son. This wasn't about money. It was about justice. It was about making sure that what happened to her didn't happen to anyone else. Jessica objected several times, but each time Judge Caldwell overruled her. It was clear that the judge was letting Berryman twist the narrative. He allowed the defense attorney to question Tabitha's credibility, even as he shut down every attempt Jessica made to challenge the officer's accounts. The pattern was undeniable. Caldwell wasn't just a passive observer. He was actively complicit in undermining this case, in protecting the officers who had caused so much harm. The realization hit Jessica like a wave. The system was rigged. But that didn't mean she was going to give up. The fight had grown personal. It was no longer just about the case. It was about making sure that the people who had been wronged, the people who had been silenced, would finally have a voice. Justice might be delayed, but it would not be denied. She would keep fighting. Outside the courtroom, the protests continued, their chants ringing louder with each passing minute. The crowds were waiting for something to change, waiting for Jessica to bring the truth to light. She couldn't let them down. Not now. Not ever. As the cross-examination came to a close, Jessica took a deep breath and stepped forward, her resolve hardening. The battle was far from over, but she would never stop fighting for what was right. She wouldn't let Judge Caldwell or anyone else stand in the way of justice. The final stand. The courtroom was a battleground, but it was no longer a place of quiet submission. The room, once filled with skepticism and indifference, had slowly begun to shift. Jessica could feel it in the air. The tension was palpable. What started as a solitary fight had become something much bigger, something that resonated beyond the four walls of the courthouse. Outside, the protesters' chants had grown louder, their voices a constant reminder of why they were there. Inside, the truth was inching its way forward, no matter how much the system tried to suppress it. Judge Caldwell had just called for another brief recess, but Jessica felt no relief. Every moment of this hearing had felt like an uphill battle, each ruling from the judge pushing her back, every attempt by the defense to discredit the victims landing like a blow. Still, Jessica stood tall. She had come too far to let this final stretch be derailed. The pieces of the puzzle were in place. The witnesses had spoken. The evidence was undeniable. And now, it was her turn to make sure the truth couldn't be ignored any longer. When the break was over, the room settled into an eerie silence. Jessica stood, her eyes briefly meeting those of the families in the gallery, those whose lives had been shattered by the actions of the officers. They were with her, every step of the way. She could feel their support in her bones, their faith in her, and it gave her strength. Jessica moved to the front of the courtroom, her heart pounding, but her steps unwavering. She was prepared. She had everything she needed. All she had to do now was deliver the final blow, the one that would cut through the walls of corruption and deceit that had built up around this case. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, clear, and stronger than it had ever been. "I know this court has heard many stories. Stories of pain, of injustice, of corruption. But it is not enough to simply hear these stories. We must act upon them. We must ensure that these stories are not silenced any longer." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the room. Judge Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. His gaze flickered briefly to the defense table, where Berryman was poised, ready to strike back with his usual venom. But Jessica wasn't backing down. Not now. "I know how easy it is to dismiss the voices of those who have been wronged," she continued. "It is far easier to ignore the suffering of a community, to pretend that the system works for everyone when it clearly does not. But I am here today to tell you that we can no longer afford to turn a blind eye. We cannot afford to allow these officers to continue to walk free, shielded by their badges and the powerful forces behind them." As she spoke, she slowly walked toward the table, her eyes locked on Judge Caldwell. There was no fear now, just determination. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for every person who had been told their pain didn't matter. It was a fight for every soul who had been crushed beneath the weight of an unjust system. "Your Honor," Jessica continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "you've heard the testimony of Reverend Newton. You've seen the video footage of Officer Kennelly's actions. You've listened to Ms. Brown's account of what happened in her home, and yet you've allowed this case to be undermined at every turn. You've questioned the credibility of the evidence, you've silenced the voices of the victims, and you've let the defense twist the truth. But today, I stand before you, not just as a lawyer, but as a witness. I stand here as someone who believes in the very principles of justice that this court was built upon." The room was silent. No one moved. Everyone was waiting. Jessica's eyes flickered briefly to the gallery, where the victims' families sat, their expressions a mix of hope and anxiety. Then she turned back to the judge, her gaze unflinching. She had their support. She had their trust, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. "This is not just about what happened in this courtroom today," Jessica said, her voice resonating in the stillness. "This is about a system that has failed to protect those who need it most. This is about a city that has been torn apart by the actions of a few, and a community that has been left to pick up the pieces. It is about time we start holding people accountable, no matter how powerful they are, no matter how untouchable they think they are." She turned toward the jury box. Though the case wasn't being tried by jury, she didn't need a jury to know what was right. She had the truth, and that, in the end, would be her greatest weapon. Today, we stand at a crossroads. We can either continue to look the other way, to let those in power continue their reign of fear and intimidation, or we can stand up for what is right. We can choose to make this a moment where truth prevails, where justice is not a privilege for the few, but a right for everyone. This case is not just about two officers. It's about the future of this city, of this country, of every person who has ever been denied justice. It's about a chance to finally make things right. The room held its breath as Jessica's words reverberated through the walls. The gavel slammed down from Judge Caldwell's hand, signaling the end of the proceedings. But Jessica wasn't finished yet. She stepped back and looked around the room once more. She could see the small flickers of change, the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The defense was quiet, their usual confidence shattered by her relentless pursuit of truth. The victims' families were no longer just hopeful, they were now emboldened. And Jessica could feel it. The tide was turning. Judge Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his eyes now fixed on Jessica. For the first time in this entire hearing, he looked uncertain. There was no smugness, no air of superiority. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes when someone finally sees the truth, even if they aren't ready to admit it. "I will take this matter under advisement," Judge Caldwell finally said, his voice softer than it had been before. "The court will reconvene in 1 week." Jessica nodded, her heart still racing, but her resolve unshaken. This wasn't over, but it was a victory in its own right. They had made it through. The truth had been spoken, and no matter what happened next, it had been heard. As she walked out of the courtroom, the sounds of protest and hope filled the air. The crowds outside were still chanting, their voices louder now. The battle was far from won, but the seeds had been planted. And as Jessica walked down those courthouse steps, she knew one thing for certain. She had made a difference. The world wasn't going to change overnight, but it had changed today. And that, in itself, was a victory. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.